Hi, I'm Paul Jay, and this is the theAnalysis.news podcast. On June 17th, Canada lost its bid to be elected to the UN Security Council. Norway received 130 votes, Ireland came in second with 114, and Canada, a somewhat distant third, with 108 votes. There are more than a few Canadians that were happy to see their government lose. In fact, there was a petition of well-known Canadians calling for Canada's defeat. The petition says, amongst other things, Canada ranks among the 12th largest arms exporters, and its weapons have fueled conflicts across the globe, including the devastating war in Yemen. In a disappointing move, they say, Canada refused to join 122 countries represented at the 2017 UN conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. And Canada refused to sign that. And for those of you that follow the theAnalysis.news, you know this is a constant topic with us. And, you know, I'm working with Daniel Ellsberg on a documentary series. And just to put this in a little bit more context, most people that understand and follow the issue of nuclear weapons and the threat of nuclear war believe there is a 100% chance, not a chance, I guess if you're at 100%, a certainty that if we continue on the path we're on of expanding the building of nuclear weapons and not moving towards their elimination, they think it's a certainty. At some point, we are going to have a nuclear war, whether it starts accidentally or otherwise, and that will be the end. So not to be part of that UN conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument and so on is outrageous. I recorded the following interview just a couple of days before the UN vote, so the tense in a few places might be a little wrong, but the reasons why people who signed the petition wanted Canada's defeat are very clear. At any rate, now joining us to discuss the campaign to deny Canada this prestigious UN seat is Yves Engler. Yves is a Montreal-based activist and author. He's published 11 books, including his latest, House of Mirrors, Justin Trudeau's Foreign Policy. He's been dubbed Canada's version of Noam Chomsky. He's been called one of the most important voices on the Canadian left and in the mold of I.F. Stone, and lots more good stuff. Thanks for joining us, Yves.
Thanks for having me.
So, Justin Trudeau presents himself as a young, progressive, hip world leader. He even joins some of the protests in Ottawa supporting the movement against police violence. Shouldn't the world want someone who, at the very least, seems more rational than Trump to have a seat at the UN Security Council?
Well, more rational than Trump is a pretty low bar. No, I think it's quite clear that Canada doesn't deserve the support of progressive-minded people for a seat on the Security Council. The two countries that Canada is competing with, Ireland and Norway, for the Western Europe and others, the two seats for Western Europe and others, have much less damaging foreign policies. And you can go from the question of nuclear arms and nuclear disarmament initiatives, where Ireland has joined in those initiatives, not part of NATO. You can take a look at the question of voting record on Palestinian rights at the UN. And since 2000, Canada has voted against 166 resolutions upholding Palestinian rights. Norway and Ireland haven't voted against one of those. You take a look at the climate question, and Canada's per capita greenhouse gas emissions are Ireland and Norway have just more than half the per capita greenhouse gas emissions. You take a look at Canada's mining industry and this massive mining sector that is involved in abuses all around the globe, and the Canadian government backs it up. Ireland and Norway don't have equivalent industries that their foreign policy are so enmeshed with. So it's really the fact that progressives don't immediately assume that Canada is unwarranted of our support for the UN's highest decision-making body is because there's this whole aura of Canada, the peacekeeping, this sort of mythology that really only holds up if you compare it to Washington. So yes, Canadian foreign policy is better than the U.S. foreign policy, but that's damning with faint praise.
Let's go through some of the issues, but let's start with the nuclear one. How did the Canadian government justify not signing this agreement to restrict the nuclear weapons?
Trudeau framed it as if you're not going to have the main nuclear powers at the meeting, there's no point in talking. That's how the Prime Minister, his argument he put forward. Which in some sort of abstract level could make some sense. So, does that mean that the next NATO meeting that Canada attends, the Canadian government is going to call for the U.S., Britain, and France to eliminate their nuclear weapons? Of course not. Rather, Canada is member in good standing of NATO, and NATO, of course, is a nuclear armed club. And Canadian officials are on NATO's a body that plans for possible nuclear warfare, and Canada, has troops on the border of Russia, which in Latvia, which increases the possibility of a nuclear conflict somewhere down the way. So Trudeau puts forward, a rationale that in some abstract level maybe makes some sense, but when both the Trudeau government's record and the Canadian government's record more generally of support and or indifference to nuclear weapons, it's a bogus rationale. But there's little in terms of opposition that holds them to account on the issue.
To what extent is the Canadian arms industry connected with the American nuclear weapons industry?
Canada has long been a exporter of uranium to the U.S. I don't believe that's that significant anymore, but for decades, U.S. nuclear weapons were aided by Canadian exports. Early on, Canada had Canadian fighter jets had U.S. nuclear weapons based in Europe, were armed with U.S. nuclear weapons, and there were obviously U.S. nuclear weapons in Canada for many decades. So I don't know how big a role today the arms industry in this country has with regards to U.S. nuclear weapons, but the arms industry more generally is the Canadian arms industry, of course, primarily makes parts for U.S. weapons, and we don't even actually know how many billions of dollars of Canadian arms exports go down to the U.S. every year, because there's an agreement where they don't even actually have to compile data on the exports. So Canada's arms industry and the U.S. arms industry act like it's all one. It's all part of one market. That, of course, is a force in favor of Canada being a supporter of NATO, a more aggressive militarist force internationally. So the arms industry and the open letter calls on the arms industry, specifically actually around sending weapons to Saudi Arabia in the context of the devastating Saudi war on Yemen, and Canada has provided significant light armored vehicles, sniper rifles, etc., to the Saudis and to the UAE while they're waging war on Yemen. But the arms industry is definitely a part of understanding why Canada has a belligerent foreign policy.
if you look at the extent to which Canada depends on the American market, it probably tells you a lot about what Canada's foreign policy is. 32% of the Canadian economy is exports, and 75% of the exports go to the United States. Of course, the bulk of that is fossil fuels. I once interviewed Canadian General Louis Mackenzie, who told me in very blunt language. I was surprised. He spoke the way he spoke. He said, I asked him, why did Canada send troops to Afghanistan? And he said, the answer is very simple. We didn't send troops to Iraq. And if we wanted to keep exporting goods to the United States, and these are his words, we had to pay in blood for the right to export, to continue exports to the United States. And so we sent troops to Afghanistan to pay the blood debt for access to the markets. And I think that tells a lot about what Canadian foreign policy is. And it's not just about the advantage of the sending stuff to the markets, goods to the markets, but it's also Canadian extractive industries abroad who depend on governments, especially in Central America, that are backed by the United States. And these are dictatorships on the whole, or very right-wing governments that help facilitate Canadian gold mining companies and otherwise. So talk a bit about the Canadian foreign policy and Canadian extractive industries.
Yeah, I mean, in the open letter, we talk about that question, which is the fact that Canada is the home of around half of the world's mining companies. Canada has about 0.5% of the world's population, so about 100 times Canada's proportion of the world's population in terms of mining companies based or listed on Canadian stock exchanges. And these companies are engaged in abuses all around the globe. Pretty much you can pick almost any country in the global south and find an example of a Canadian mining company involved in a conflict with a local community where the people have been killed around the mine. And this is all incredibly well documented. And in the letter, we talk about how about a half dozen UN bodies have criticized the Canadian government for not reining in Canadian companies abroad, specifically targeting mining companies, extractive companies. And so the Trudeau government, before they got elected, said they were going to bring in some better regulations on Canadian mining companies operating abroad. They were going to bring in an ombudsperson with some teeth. And then after, and they repeated that promise a number of times, and after aggressive lobbying from the mining sector, 6-8 months ago, they announced this new ombudsperson that basically has no capacity to even force companies to provide documents and very little capacity to end public support for Canadian mining companies found to be engaged in abuses abroad. And at the same time, so while they haven't brought in any of the restrictions they promised they would bring in, at the same time they've been lobbying aggressively for very controversial mining companies. The worst example being in Tanzania, where Barrick Gold, probably the most controversial of all Canadian mining companies, at one point the biggest gold company in the world. They were in a major conflict back in 2017 with the Tanzanian government and over hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in unpaid taxes, royalties, and one of their mines in Tanzania, the North Mara mine, had 65 people, according to the official statistics. Some say actually more, but 65 people have been killed between 2006 and 2016 by Barrick-paid security forces around the mine. And the Canadian High Commissioner in Tanzania, Ian Miles, while this big conflict's going on between the Tanzanian government and Barrick, organizes a meeting for the president of Tanzania and the president of Barrick, and then after the meeting comes out and makes a declaration about how Barrick upholds the highest standards of corporate social responsibility, and basically gives the diplomatic explicit diplomatic support for the company in their conflict with the Tanzanian government. And so if you can back Barrick Gold amidst, the most controversial mining company in the place where they're committed the worst abuses, it basically is a sign of the Trudeau government being willing to back Canadian mining companies sort of no matter what. And so, increasingly people around the world, I don't know how much of this trickles up into the realm of the diplomatic world or the UN ambassadors in New York, but increasingly people around the world associate Canada with mining companies that come in and push peasants off their land, destroy waterways and ecosystems, etc.
I've often wondered if there isn't in sometimes an actual division of labor, quote unquote, where Canada gets an assignment on behalf of the U.S. empire to do some dirty work. Certainly we saw that during the Vietnam War, where Canada helped spy for the United States while it was supposedly working on an international control commission, which was not supposed to be spying, but it came out that it did. I believe that was during the time of Trudeau's father, the other Prime Minister Trudeau. But Venezuela seems to be another example. I've talked about this before, but in 2004, when I was in Venezuela, I decided to go see the Canadian embassy. And, I was the executive producer of a well-known CBC television debate show, as well as I'm a known filmmaker. And so the embassy knew who I was and said, come. And when I went to the embassy in Caracas, they had organized a meeting for me with about 7 or 8 members of the anti-Chavista opposition. And for about 2 hours, told me story after story about how horrible the Chavez was and how horrible the government was. I mean, whether what they were saying was true or not is kind of not the point. What business did the Canadian embassy have for playing that kind of role of directly organizing and collaborating with the Venezuelan opposition? And of course, it got even worse later. So what do you make of Canada's role in being so much in the lead on the question of supporting the opposition in Venezuela?
Well, I think you're exactly right when you talk about division of labor within the U.S. empire. The Canadian government was, with Peru, the two countries that set up, and I think it's really the Canadian government that pushed the process, set up the Lima Group of countries opposed to the Maduro government of Venezuela. And it frames itself as being a non-U.S., U.S. isn't part of it, and sort of, it's sort of this coalition of Latin American countries outside of the grip of Washington, concerning itself with democracy and human rights in Venezuela. Canadian governments had, I think, held 3 different Lima Group meetings in Canada, just really aggressive support for the Lima Group, and that's definitely an example of its preferred. I think some of the Latin American countries would be more uncomfortable to join such a coalition if the U.S. was explicitly a member of it and was explicitly driving the initiative. That's just one part of Canada's aggressive, brazen campaign to oust the Venezuelan government, and the UN recognized government. We point that out in the open letter. This is the government recognized by the Maduro government, the one recognized by the United Nations, and not Juan Guaido. And Canada has 4 rounds of sanctions against Venezuela, and I don't think the sanctions have that great of an impact on Venezuelan economic life. But I think that one of the things they do is they provide a little bit of sort of legitimacy to the U.S. sanctions, which are, of course, much more damaging. And so the fact that they can say that Canada is also sanctioning Venezuela, that's something that the Trump administration likes. Canada's taken the Venezuela International Criminal Court, and even actually, if you look at how the Trudeau, when he brought Venezuela to the International Criminal Court, the first time ever that a member state, a number of Latin American countries brought with Canada brought Venezuela to the ICC. First time ever a member state brought another member state to the ICC. So look at all the human rights violations in the world, and that's certainly what's going on in Venezuela is not the worst of it. But how Trudeau justified bringing it during a speech announced during the speech at the General Assembly in 2018, UN General Assembly, he framed it as the ICC being something that the Bush administration didn't like, and this was Canada upholding the international rules-based order and upholding the ICC as this institution, multilateral institution, when it was clear that bringing the ICC was a step down the path of supporting the Trump administration's bid for regime change in Venezuela. So clearly Canada has taken on really aggressively this part of the U.S.-led campaign that enables Washington to move forward with overthrowing the Venezuelan government. But it should be noted, as we noted in the open letter, that if you look at Canada's allies on this campaign against Venezuela, that's again supposedly about democracy, constitution, human rights. Well, the president in Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, his constitutional legitimacy is almost nil. The Honduran constitution is clear that only one term. Juan Orlando Hernandez got the court to allow him to run a second term when he's losing by 5 percentage points after 60% of votes counted. All of a sudden, counting stops when it comes back on. Now, all of a sudden, Juan Orlando is in the lead. So his constitutional legitimacy is infinitely less than Maduro's. Or if you take a look at human rights violations, Iván Duque in Colombia, I mean, more than 100 social activists killed last year, according to UN in Colombia. Even worse rate so far at the start of this year. Demobilized FARC, former guerrilla, also another 75 or something like that, former guerrilla. Duque has tried to undermine the peace accord with the former guerrillas in Colombia. So you look at the human rights violations, much worse human rights violations taking place in Colombia than in Venezuela. You look at Canada's role in Haiti and supporting the Jovenel Moïse presidency in Haiti, almost no support. Massive demonstrations in Haiti, multiple general strikes, one for more than a month. The only reason Jovenel Moïse, who's highly repressive, corrupt, the election that he supposedly won, almost no one participated in. Only reason Jovenel Moïse is in office in Haiti is because of support of Washington and Ottawa. Also, Jovenel Moïse is part of the Lima Group opposition to Venezuela.
Is Canada's positioning in Haiti and Honduras simply a reflection of its kind of pro-American bias or its own economic interest? I
think it's both happening at the same time. Earlier when you talked about Canada delivering so many goods crossing the border to the U.S. and therefore Canada had to send troops to Afghanistan. I think there's a major degree of truth to that. But compare that to Mexico. Right, Mexico's economy is comparably, and maybe even more so, dependent on trade with the U.S. But Mexico doesn't have as sort of pro-Washington foreign policy in the region or the world, for that matter. And that's not to say that there's not problems with Mexican foreign policy. I'm sure if you look into it, there are many. I think that the Canadian ruling class, the Canadian elite, for a long time, have seen the world and profited from the world in a very similar way to the U.S. elite. Incredible levels of integration among the two countries' elites. There's a question of white supremacy in this. There's a question of there's a linguistic question. So I think that the Canadian ruling class, yes, it's its support for Juan Orlando Hernandez in Honduras is tied to the fact that U.S. backs him, but it's also tied to the fact that Gildan Activewear, big Montreal T-shirt maker, has major operations there, and helped to overthrow the Manuel Zelaya government back in 2009, or Goldcorp, second biggest gold company in Canada. They were actually found back in 2009. They were found to be paying people to go into protest in support of the coup against Zelaya, and they were unhappy with Zelaya's mining policy, and Gildan was unhappy with increasing of the minimum wage. So it's a mix of being tied into Washington and following what Washington does, but also that Canadian corporations and Canadian capital are major players in many countries, certainly throughout this hemisphere, and they view the world and profit from it in a very similar way to the U.S. elite.
In your open letter, you say that Ottawa has stated it will act as a, quote, asset for Israel on the council. What's the context for that?
Well, that's Chrystia Freeland, who's the former Foreign Affairs Minister, now the Deputy Prime Minister, back in November of 2018 at an event in Israel alongside Benjamin Netanyahu. And I think what the context is, it reflects this extreme pro-Israel disposition of the Trudeau government. But the context of it, in part, is that an understanding that one of the big weaknesses for Canada's candidacy for the UN is that there's an understanding that there's a lot of opposition to Canada's policy of voting against UN resolutions, and so there was a sense that the campaign to win a seat on the Security Council would lead the Trudeau government to taking more pro-Palestinian positions, because that's the sentiment of the overwhelming majority of UN member states. And so I think partly what she was doing was trying to allay some fears within Israel of that Canada might move in a away from this staunch pro-Israel perspective. But in practice, they did one vote back in December, the first vote in favor of Palestinian rights that they actually voted for, and there was a whole bunch of media attention devoted to that vote. And it was viewed as, tied to their campaign for the Security Council seat. But in practice, the Canadian government has just continued with this extreme anti-Palestinian policy. Just one example, earlier this year, the Canadian ambassador in Israel, Deborah Lyons, organized a party for Canadians who fight in Israeli military. It was a pizza party, and she said at the time that the Canada was proud. They were fighting. I think it's about 50. I forget the exact number of Canadians fighting in the IDF. Now, of course, these Canadians fighting in the IDF would be administering the occupation in the West Bank. They would be part of firing on peaceful March of Return protesters in Gaza. And Canada actually has a law, the Foreign Enlistment Act, on the books that says it's illegal to recruit for a foreign army. And there was also charitable law that says charities that are not allowed to raise funds for other countries' militaries. But here you have Canada's ambassador organizing a pizza party for Canadians fighting in the Israeli military. That's just one of the examples of just this extreme anti-Palestinian policy of the Trudeau government that I think we're hoping. There's actually a second public letter that's focused specifically on Canada's anti-Palestinian policies that's been emailed to, I think it's more than 800 UN ambassadors. We're hoping that there's also that issue will resonate with some of the UN ambassadors, and that they will vote against Canada's bid for Security Council seat, in part because of their anti-Palestinian positions.
I'm quoting now from the open letter. Falling short of its responsibilities as a global citizen, Canada continues to oppose the Basel Ban amendment on the export of waste from rich to poor countries, which became binding in late 2019 after ratification by 97 countries. So 97 countries signed this thing and Canada wouldn't? How does the Trudeau government justify that?
Very weak justification. Try to basically not talk about it. And there was a conflict between Canada and Philippines over multiple containers of trash. I believe the claim was they were recyclables that were sent from Canada to the Philippines. This goes back like 4 or 5 years. So it goes to this, I think it predates the Trudeau government. And then Trudeau twice, when he was in the Philippines for two different conferences, promised that he would deal with this waste that was sent from Canada there to the Philippines. And it finally did about a year ago, I guess. They finally did bring this waste back from the Philippines, but the Canadian government's stated rationale is that we should be allowed to export recyclables, and they sort of, even though there's this long history of the companies say they're exporting recyclable products, but in fact it's dirty diapers and regular household trash. There's a long history of that.
Well, if they're recyclables, why would you bother exporting them?
Well, that's a whole other question. I think a lot of Canada's recycling has gone to China over the years and stuff like that. So both Ireland, and I should point this out, both Ireland and Norway, the two countries Canada is competing for at the Security Council, have signed the Basel Ban amendment. But this is like, this obviously should be an absolute no-brainer. How in the world could Canada not sign this convention? It's actually an amendment of a convention. But if you actually look at it more closely, there's a whole bunch of these different treaties or conventions that Canada hasn't signed, including at the International Labour Organization. I was kind of surprised looking into that. There's all these statutes that Canada hasn't signed. Fairly recent one on Indigenous issues that Canada hasn't signed. So this is under a government. The whole foreign policy rhetoric of Justin Trudeau government, the primary sort of branding is international rules-based order. International rules-based order. They say it over and over, particularly Chrystia Freeland.
Well, how about this? Here I'm quoting from the statement again. Ottawa also failed to ratify the United Nations optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, and Degrading Treatment or Punishment. How the hell could they not sign that?
They cannot sign it because the Americans don't like it, and there's almost no one in this country that are going to hold them to account on it. And they cannot just not sign it. They cannot sign it and run around saying their whole foreign policy is designed to advance the international rules-based order. I mean, the hypocrisy is just so flagrant, but there is very little in terms of groups or opposition parties within the country that are going to, put pressure on them to follow through. And if, Washington doesn't want them to sign it, or if there's a handful of companies in this country that want to export waste to the Philippines, well... Okay,
here's one I really don't get. I'm quoting from the statement again. In November 2019, Canada once again refused to back a widely supported UN resolution on, quote, combating glorification of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and other practices that contribute to fueling contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Now, I don't understand that just in terms of their own PR-ish feel good about what Canadian foreign policy supposedly is. How can they not sign that?
It's even worse than that. In their first 2 months after they took office, or maybe a bit more than a month after they took office in 2015, they voted no. In the last couple of years, they just abstained. Almost every country in the world backs that resolution. The previous Harper government voted no a couple of times as well. And the only other countries that vote no is the U.S. and and the Ukraine. And this resolution is perceived by the hawks in Washington as how they frame it is this is a Russian effort to embarrass the Ukraine. Now, of course, the Canadian government has a few hundred troops in the Ukraine, training Ukrainian forces that are involved in the conflict in the east of the country. Canada's pumped a whole bunch of money into backing the right-wing forces within the Ukraine. This goes back, years and a whole lot in recent years. The police in the Ukraine that are have these neo-Nazi ties. The Canadian military attaché in Kiev, I think it was in the end of 2018, he met with representatives of the Azov Battalion, one of the far right neo-Nazi groups in the Ukraine, sort of paramilitary force that actually incorporated into the Ukrainian military. So that's the explanation. I mean, basically, Canada has jumped completely into this campaign of using the Ukraine as a place to try to weaken Russia and the forces within the Ukraine that are most into this this campaign of targeting Russia have all kinds of associations, historic and current, with neo-Nazi forces, and so the Canadian government doesn't want to back this resolution at the UN. And again, no one talks about it, right? It doesn't even get brought up in the Canadian media, and so they know they can get away with it.
Well, I think I'm convinced. Ireland or Norway? Okay, choose Ireland or Norway, Yves.
Well, there's 2 seats, so it's 3 countries going for 2 seats. So both Ireland and Norway should get it. Well, hopefully they'll both win it. Now, it's important to point out. Canada has incredible advantages. Canada speaks the 2 main colonial languages, part of the Francophonie, part of the Commonwealth, part of, member of the G7, a much bigger country, much bigger diplomatic apparatus, has, board positions at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. So in principle, Canada has much greater capacity to offer things to other countries, to lobby other countries and all that. So if Canada does lose the seat, that's a pretty strong indication that there is a rejection of this pro-U.S., pro-mining, pro-oil, anti-Palestinian foreign policy that is dominant in this country.
There was a extremely telling moment at the UN Security Council, and that's just before the American invasion of Iraq, where a lot of American normally allies, especially France, opposed the U.S. move towards the intervention in Iraq. And Chrétien, at the time, Prime Minister Chrétien, spoke fairly openly against the invasion of Iraq, although then, as we've talked about, did make up for it by going into Afghanistan. But there was some distancing by Chrétien on the Iraq war. Do you think that this Trudeau government would part ways over something like that, similar circumstances, whether it's a provocation against Iran or something else? Is there any of that, any distancing at all that can be seen from the Trudeau government, distancing from the U.S.?
The Chrétien government did not give the Bush administration what it wanted most of all, which was official endorsement of the coalition of the willing. Minus that, they provided all kinds of supports, right? So they were in charge of a NATO naval task force, and the Chrétien government had a legal opinion that because they were in charge of this task force that was stopping Iraqi vessels, that they were legally at war with Iraq, and Canadian troops were part of U.S. Training missions. It was at one point there was a Canadian general in charge of 35,000 troops in Iraq. There's a whole series of ways in which Canada did support the war, but they didn't give the Bush administration what they wanted most of all, because there was massive demonstrations across Canada, particularly in Quebec. It was so unpopular, and there was also elections coming up in Quebec, and the Liberals were in power in Quebec, and Chrétien was very concerned of the Parti Québécois, the sovereigntist party, winning again, and a possible return to another referendum. So it was really the popular uprising or popular opposition, and this is really important. There's a real recent film that just came out about the explanation for why Canada didn't go into Iraq formally, and they basically completely wipe out the question of mobilization. They interviewed Chrétien a bunch of times, and Chrétien talked about how he wasn't sure about the evidence of weapons of mass destruction, and basically frames it as his enlightened position rather than a power calculation based upon massive mobilization. It was very cold days here in Montreal, and the biggest demo was over 200,000, around 200,000 people. So that's, I think, some of the background. So if that was to happen with a war that Donald Trump led, I think you can have a scenario. If there was a massive mobilization against Canada contributing to a U.S.-led war, I think Trudeau would do something similar to what Chrétien did. In some ways, it's even easier with Donald Trump, who is so easy to demonize and so unpopular in Canada. It makes it even easier not to be part of it. But the reality, this is that necessitates this huge outpouring of activism. If that doesn't exist, the disposition of the not just the Trudeau government, not the Conservative government, not even including probably the never happened before, but possible NDP government, the disposition is to just go along with Washington's direction unless there's a big popular mobilization. So even if the public is strongly against it, but it's not mobilized, they'll still go along with whatever U.S.-led war. So that's where the question, and that's the whole point of this petition around opposing Canada's bid to Security Council. It's about mobilizing people behind progressive ideas and using the opportunity of a bid for a Security Council seat to put forward some critical discussion around Canadian foreign policy.
Okay, thanks very much for joining us, Yves.
Thanks a lot for having me.
And thank you for joining us on the theAnalysis.news podcast.